Trotsky. It is necessary to help the masses in the process of the daily struggle to find the bridge between present demands and the socialist program of the revolution. This bridge should include a system of transitional demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat. Trotsky proposes an infrastructural metaphor for political progress, but masses are stranded as if on one side of a river. On this side is their daily economic struggle: piecework, wage cuts, the undesired shortening or lengthening of the working day, overtime, job insecurity, pensions, safety on the job, medical insurance, speed of the assembly line, union representation and solidity, supervision and surveillance, the constantly renewed struggle just to get up in the morning, reliability of pay, the calibration of future expectations, how my kids will be, I work for this, the need to be realistic, contradiction. On the other side of the bridge is communism. There is, Trotsky implies, there must be, a bridge. All we need to do is help the workers find a towering piece of fixed capital infrastructure. The commercial folk duo Simon and Garfunkel, whose own transitional program has sold over 25 million copies since its release in 1971, might have agreed with this piece of social analysis. There are, to my knowledge, still no available sales figures for the death agony of capitalism in the Fourth International, which is where that quote from Trotsky is taken. And the conditions for such an analysis assuredly have begun to, quote, get somewhat rotten, as Trotsky himself, in collaboration with American leaders of the soon-to-be-formed Socialist Workers' Party, said of the conditions for the proletarian revolution in 1947. Trotskyist groups, too, have decomposed in the last 3 decades, without yet quite acquiring the distinctive purple-bluish coloration of the old communist parties. But this is enough politico-forensic entomology for one paper. The metaphor from the death agony is an urbanist paysage sentimental, a scene of extraction in which sentiment is harvested from the natural scene, shipped down the Thames, the Havel, or the Rio de la Plata, and traded into the commercial and political centres of mid-20th century industrial capitalism, a transcendental aesthetics that needs its raw materials. When seated at his typewriter, Trotsky was probably not given to think of the little town of Morpeth or the village of Mitford. For that reason, he was not likely, when he wrote The Death Agony, to have been contemplating the river that this paper will discuss in most detail, the river Wensbeck in Northumberland, which served as the more conventional paysage sentimental for another writer of another revolutionary era, the Reverend William Bowles. Thus Bowles. This is on the handout if anyone has it. I won't read all of it. As slowly wanders thy sequestered stream, Wensbeck, the mossy scattered rocks among, in fancy's ear still making plaintive song, to the dark woods above, the waving seem to bend or some enchanted spot removed from life's vain scenes. I listen to the wind, and think I hear meek sorrow's plaint. Once adjusted for inflation, Bowles's sonnets of 1789 were about as successful with the gallantly emancipated would-be nature spirits of the English bourgeoisie as Art and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Waters was with the long-haired affirmatives of the US counterculture, who, in 1971, were beginning to pack away their anti-Vietnam placards and leap into the stagnant, and therefore perhaps not quite troubled, waters of the, quote, jobs market, as the unofficial end of Bretton Woods led to dollar devaluation, declining purchasing power, and a premonitory uptick in unemployment. There's a graph for that on your handout. While they filled in and mailed off their job applications, those student activists might have taken comfort from the cooing spiritual remittances of Art Garfunkel's "When You're Down and Out, When You're on the Street," although Garfunkel's ungrammatical claim that he will lay me down like a bridge over troubled waters, no doubt influenced in its solipsistic form, as well as its Rusk-like content, by Martin Heidegger's insistence that, quote, bridges and hangars, stadiums and power stations are buildings, but not dwellings, would likely have sounded a false note to any American for whom being down and out on the street involves sleeping under bridges and not submitting to peaceful coitus in the arms of a man who happened to labour under the false impression that he was like one. But whether Trotsky's pathico-political infrastructure crosses the river Wensbeck, the river Niagara, or the river Island is perhaps not especially important. The metaphor at work is of good provenance. On this side of the river, life's vain scenes, vain from the latter's vainness, meaning empty, idle, or unprofitable, the economic scene of the daily struggle, of present demands. Bowles has a controversialist sense for these connotations. Daily life is literally full, active and profitable. It is, he thinks, metaphorically empty, idle and unrewarding. But one of his limits as a poet is that he could never recognise that for many on this side, life might be literally full and active, but both metaphorically and literally unprofitable. That is to say, more vain than an ironic poetic genre convention is ever apt to express. Moving on, at the other side of the river, in Some Enchanted Spot, we find the accomplished seizure of the organs of coercion by the working classes, the real movement towards communism and the self-abolition of the proletariat, where, just as I, the Reverend William Bowles, listen to the wind and think I hear meek sorrow's plaint, so too the basic fact of an enormous project for the collective advance of humanity is perceptible in even the most mundane performance of social labour. Bowles's politely small and temperate volume of sonnets, published to no immediate public acclaim at about the time that Paris was tearing the detested Bastille to the ground, Bowles's sonnets were startling to their best readers because they shattered a set of options that seemed, for 18th century verse writers, to be impossible to decline. The poems were neither pathetic nor exact, and the everyday occurrences of nature removed from life's vain scenes, and animal truth is made possible. I listen to the wind and think I hear meek sorrow's plaint, writes Bowles. These are momentous changes in the open book of the senses. Using Trotsky's terms, Bowles's basic demand of the wind is that it is the wind. Life is life, money is money, the wind is the wind. It is not true that you get what you pay for. Filipino workers in Romanian textile factories are often paid nothing, Greek public sector workers the same, slaves in East London have a similar complaint. And if Bowles had listened hard to the wind and heard nothing, he would certainly have been justified in making recourse to Pan's employment tribunal at the foot of the slopes of Parnassus. Likewise, had Bowles attended the Urfa Congress in 1891, but alas, Bowles passed in 1850, he would have known that his maximum demand of the wind ought to be that it personify itself immediately as sorrow, no seeming at all, venting her plaint and spleen like Miss Muffet in the mood for regurgitation. Bowles could well have chosen to make exactly that demand. He could very easily have written of the wind that when he listens to it, he does or must hear meek sorrow's plaint. I hear meek sorrow's plaint. But he does not make this kind of demand. Instead, he makes neither a maximum nor a minimum demand of nature, but instead a third kind of demand, an interstitial, a transitional kind. This equivocation was not by any means an inexpugnable defence against literary ridicule. Johnson's Lives of the Poets are full of instances where bad similes and lumbering personifications are judged to be worse for the ambivalence of their use. When Dryden writes of the goodly ship London that, quote, she seems a sea wasp flying on the waves, his nemesis Elkanah Settle tells him outright that he only makes, quote, his humble comparison of a wasp more ridiculous when he does not say it flies upon the waves as nimbly as a wasp or the like, but it seemed a wasp. If the boat isn't like a wasp, why then say it seems to look like one? Idiot. Thus Settle to Dryden. And certainly Bowles could appear to be just as stupidly uncertain. After all, there he is, standing about in some enchanted spot, his facial features screwed up with unseemly concentration, listening intently to decide whether the wind seems like sorrow, or if it really is sorrow's plaint. What Coleridge, for example, would have admired in these lines from Bowles is the recession from a maximum demand as the linguistic realisation of its possibility. If poetry is to have once again the beauties of the fancy, for decades now cheapened by advances in sector productivity, it must first of all revive the language of seeming, of apparition, delusion and misprision. The psychological reality of hesitation is a prophylactic against the generic literary implausibility of certitude. To hear sorrow's plaint on the wind requires the advanced admission that perhaps we hear nothing of the sort. There will be no real transition to maximum demands until the proletariat believes that its immediate demands will not continue to be met. The basic problem faced by Trotsky, and indeed by every revolutionary thinker writing in the 1940s, however much they might have resented the Fourth International, no matter how much they cared or didn't care for August Thalheimer, was the same problem revolutionaries face today. How can the obvious fact of the mass suffering produced by capitalist relations of social reproduction induce in the victims of that suffering both the will and the means for the creation of new and better forms of life? It is more than a stubborn question, and Trotsky's retreat to the metaphor of a bridge is of course entirely vague and impressionistic. Furthermore, the transitional demands within the transitional programme are not properly articulated concepts, but are in fact only the deliberate expression of the insufficiencies of minimal and maximum demands as the tradition of social democracy had defined them. Trotsky's slogans for a sliding scale of wages in public works are in truth perfectly basic. The sliding scale of wages is not stuck at $1 billion an hour. The workers will not work for 30 minutes per day erecting golden leisure pyramids for their own use during the time that remains. William Bowles's answer to these problems, made at the exact historical moment when the creditable possibility for plebeian seizure of political power was spreading to spots as distantly removed from Paris as Port d'Envaux and La Rochelle, if not yet to Northumberland or the Shetlands, is very directly concerned with the issue of the value of the object that the maximum demand repudiates. He writes, "I listen to the wind and think I hear meek sorrow's plaint, and if Bowles thinks wrongly, if he hears only the wind, then the question of the reality or unreality of redemption hardly matters." Some of you may recognise that last phrase as the one used by Adorno at the end of Minima Moralia. Nothing here could be further from the truth. The person who situates herself between a minimum and a maximum demand, who hesitates at the border of ecstasy and thinks that she hears what she knows she does not, this person does not find a bridge to an otherwise unattainable maximum, but only the terrific and glaring confusion of bad language every day straining against the rope of its enabling syntax and lexicon. What then will the experience of a transition be? A transitional demand can only be made of an object which someone, the professional revolutionary or the avant-garde or whoever, knows in advance to be incapable of meeting it. And the demand that we make on an object that we understand in advance is incapable of meeting it can only lead otherwise to disappointment. Disappointment is the fate of that demand unless we expect, as revolutionaries do expect, the object to be incinerated in the heat of what we need from it, and to throw up from its ashes in a sheet of fresh fire a new and greater object in its place, communism. The opposite of a transition so defined is a fluctuation, a movement in feeling or desire away from an object which determines that movement and determines also a subsequent return to it. Let's try to firm up that distinction. In 1923, the reactionary comedian G.K. Chesterton placed a maximum demand on a potato. A potato, wrote Chesterton, in dispute with all the traducers of what he called the magnificent phrase, is a poem. Not only that, it is even an ascending scale of poems, loads of poems, beginning in subterranean grotesques of the Gothic manner, with humps like the deformities of a goblin and the eyes like the beast of Revelation, and rising up through the green shades of the earth to a crown that has the shape of stars and the hue of heaven. Chesterton was a more prolific, but also a more stupid writer than Bowles. In this, his oafish Ars Potato, the great virtue of language, and of stately versified language in particular, is that it can never be said, in principle, to break down under any demand of any kind. There is not, and there never can be, an occasion for transition. Not only does communism fail to supersede the root vegetable is a drainless source of pleasure and amusement. Heaven can be abstracted from the top of a Maris piper, infinity from the tray of a vending machine. Please call Schernco Limited Customer Services for thousands of years of immeasurable bliss. There is, this is of course the point, no way to determine a limit to these promises. Linguistic reality is magnificently apt to be manipulated. Invention is inexhaustible. Brecht, Chesterton would have thought, was an idiot when he wrote in his disastrously prosaic lyric to German proletarian housewives that, quote, Brecht, "Your condition is bad, it will worsen," end quote. For how could it be so, when each housewife could gaze forever through the glittering window of a soap bubble onto landscapes that pulse behind their sheet of shifting light with the same measure as the heart, towards a sky that beckons with the ardour of love and the tenderness of solace? Blah, blah, blah. Chesterton is capital's door-to-door salesman of maximum demand. With magnificent phrases, any object can be made to sustain any wish we put to it. Transition is transcendently redundant. Bowles's poem, by contrast, makes perception fluctuate to accommodate for a plausible transition in the object itself. We are now, I hope, beginning to centre on the modern Ersatz in individual expression for those collective transformations of social relations that individual experience is powerless to accomplish. To try to make that point more real, I want now to attempt what in the language of marketing suasion would be called a thought experiment. Imagine then that Trotsky's bridge between present demands and the programme of the socialist revolution is literal. In fact, replace socialist revolution with something like collective happiness. The bridge is bought by a state using taxation revenue and loans. In consequence of the use of this bridge, or of many bridges like it, capital begins to circulate faster in the economy. As it does so, profits in firms begin to rise. Increasing profits lead to new investments, what Marx would call in Volume 2 of Das Kapital the capitalization of part of the surplus, which generate further employment and, in consequence, economic expansion. As the demand for labour increases relative to its supply, wages begin to rise also, as Adam Smith prognosticated humanely even in 1776, when he composed his chapter of The Wealth of Nations dealing with wages, as an attack on the false and self-interested doctrines of employers. Rising living standards for workers will cause increased consumption of consumer goods, and so a further advance in revenue and profit for employers. States, possessed of an enlarged revenue, will create more bridges, more social amenities, and new and as yet unconceived forms of human communication. The bridge between minimum and maximum demands is a literal bridge. Its identification is not revolutionary. It requires no proletarian intervention except the intervention of the proletarians who build it. This is the thought experiment. Now, tell me, right now, why this cannot happen. If anyone wants to try. Given where we are, and who we are, and the topic of our conversation today, I make the assumption that you wish strongly to disagree with my statement about infrastructure. Infrastructure investment is not capable of banishing the need for a revolution against capitalist social relations. The account of growth I have provided is like no growth on the face of this earth. The image convicts real economic growth as the malignant blemish that it in fact is. Getting communism out of a thought experiment is no easier than getting heaven out of a potato, or it is just as easy, which is the same thing. But if you are like me, or like William Lyle Bowles, listening to this wind will cause you to have a particularly plaintive and sorrowful kind of experience. The experience will be something close, maybe just for a moment, to panic. As I listen to arguments like this, I find myself a little embarrassed and confounded. And as I struggle to resist the conclusions to which the argument seems to lead, I search to find the weakness in its links. The argument must be false. A philosopher might say that the argument, though it is internally coherent, is based on false premises. But this is not my experience of it. The argument has no premises that I can know. Its concepts are undefined, and at best it derives its authority from a set of macroeconomic assumptions in which we, its addressees, can be more or less adept in reproducing. I will put this another way. As you listen to the argument, you might feel a slight panic. Once you have stood your ground, you will know that the argument is meaningless. The basic demand that you will place on the argument is this, that it contain meaning, and that the argument does not contain meaning, but only a set of concepts whose relation seems to be implied by a formalistic logic belonging to bourgeois economics, does not prevent the argument from acquiring that meaning at some later date. We only need to start to define our terms. Are you still with me? Lots of you must not be. It's my experience. But the provisional sense of the meaninglessness of this argument, the knowledge that, right now, it fails to meet your basic demand, will not yet stop another more impetuous desire from asserting itself, the desire to place a maximum demand on the object that this argument is, namely, the demand that it not only prove itself to be meaningful, but it prove itself to be possible too, here on the face of this earth and with these social relations today. At that moment, the transitional demands that you made on an argument which, you knew in advance, could not meet the demand on its own terms, fades out, and in its place glows a new demand and another object, and this object is not a meaningless argument about economic growth, but real relations of capitalist production and exchange. If this account of my experience communicates something of your experience also, you will have experienced a bridge. Unlike Trotsky's bridge, however, this bridge, in your experience, will not lead from immediate to maximum demands, but back from a maximum demand whose articulation against a social relation is not so much fantastical as absolutely misconstrued. Have we identified in the poetry of the 89er William Bowles, and in the misconstrual of the demands which an argument might sustain, the experience of a transition? No. Life, writes the sometime Nazi mortician Gottfried Benn, is bridge building. In the precincts of bourgeois interiority, a bridge is built, arched in cathexis towards a plateau made of blood. This is Benn, or almost Benn. On top of it, at the point to which your maximum demand carries you, there is a lozenge. That's figure 3. Climb through it. On the other side of the lozenge, you discover your minimum demand. This transition is not the transformation of reformist into revolutionary consciousness, and still less is it the shattering of an object under the weight of a demand that it must preempt and obviate if it is to survive. It is, instead, the experience of that ceaseless fluctuation that under capitalism has no better model than the fluctuation of a market price around a fixed value whose ultimate determination is abstract socially necessary labour time, or, if we retrench on those syllables, in accordance with the deficit reduction plan of positivist consciousness, work. William Bowles's poem is one of the first places in the language where disenchantment is euphemised into the fluctuation of promising incertitude, expressive personhood not so much traded on the bourse as materially derived from it, laissez-faire heard on the wind in Northumberland. Collectivity is the ulterior impulse of individual fluctuations in feeling. Reactionaries like G.K. Chesterton, reminiscing on the great Irish potato heaven, know this better than we do. In Chesterton's work, fluctuations are played off against their ulterior impulses in a traffic of thought whose prospective security is held in the knowledge that each move made for the outer rim of desire is destined to be pulled back into line, just as each aberration in prices is forever, if unpredictably, liable to be corrected. The poetry that opposes this logic, now the most basic logic of all, has to cut right into the heart of these demands, their fluctuations and the collective social relations that constitute their essential unity, right into the centre of correction, or, in fact, as it may be, the centre for correction, into which no bridge leads, however diverse the songs that we may wish to sing about it. That's it.